introduction, neatly and nice. So the recording is opened, as you heard. My introduction was nicely within the limit of 5 minutes. I invite all speakers to respect the limits of their introduction or intervention. And I give now the floor to Dr. Lee Jackson, as I said, head of the Agro-Food and Trade and Markets Division at the Trade and Agricultural Directorate, OECD. Lee, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here and to share this OECD report with you all. So a few years ago, we started seeing these really alarming headlines that food systems were broken and that they needed radical reform. And of course, these types of headlines and those messages catalyzed a lot of discussions on food systems. And those discussions have obviously intensified this year as we lead into the UN Food Systems Summit. So our team at the OECD has recently produced a report, which is the subject of this webinar today. And before my colleague Koen presents the details of the report, I just wanted to share a little bit of an overview of the OECD work in this area. So I'll focus on some of the work we've done leading into this year, what our report that was published this year highlights, so the past and the present, and then just a few words about our future work to give you a teaser about what's coming up. So the OECD work related to food systems actually spans decades. You wouldn't see it in the titles of the reports we've done, but we've covered topics ranging from monitoring support to agriculture to modeling medium-term outlooks for agricultural commodity markets. We've also worked on developing insights on risk management and resilience, and in another stream of work have developed insights on agricultural productivity and innovation. And we've been collecting facts on food systems and agriculture for a long time. For over 30 years, we've shown how government support to agriculture distorts markets, harms the environment, and is largely ineffective at improving livelihoods. But despite all the evidence that we've produced, our monitoring also shows that policy reform has been elusive. Last year, our monitoring report, for example, showed that more than $700 billion was provided in annual agricultural support. And similarly, we have a review of fisheries monitoring and evaluation, which highlighted that 1/3 of government support to fisheries lowers the cost of inputs such as fuel and vessels and gears. And this, of course, encourages overfishing. So this leads me to my second point. We've seen with evidence the types of policies that are in place that can actually harm the environment and distort markets. So our report today actually shifts some of the perspective from what's going on with food systems to how we can think about crafting more effective food systems policies. So you'll hear from Koen that the report highlights evidence describing a very complex triple challenge that's faced by the food systems, which includes ensuring food security and nutrition, providing livelihoods for stakeholders all along the food chain, and also doing this while making sure that it's done in an environmentally sustainable way. But rather than exclusively focusing on the challenges, our analysis digs into the questions of why policy reform in agriculture and food can be so difficult. And as we adopt this type of systems perspective, it becomes clear that actually addressing these challenges in a coherent way requires better coordination and communication among different parts of government. The report also provides insights into the process of policy reform, showing that disagreements over facts and interests and values can get in the way of necessary policy reforms, and understanding these frictions can help us manage the trade-offs and synergies of different policy instruments. So to create better policies, we need more than facts and evidence. We also need to work on developing a shared view of how the world should be. So our report provides some insights into policymaking processes, and Koen will talk about these processes that seek to generate trusted evidence, avoid policy capture, and to reconcile, importantly, differing values. So the last point I wanted to make was just to highlight some of our future work at the OECD that will contribute to making better food systems policies. We're actively engaging with preparations for the UN Food Systems Summit, and this includes working, talking with scientific experts that are working in the 5 action track areas. We're engaging with the UN Food Systems Summit Secretariat, and in particular the FAO. And we've been commenting, drawing on the wealth of evidence and analysis OECD has on all aspects of the food system to provide inputs and feedback on some of the reports that are being produced in the build up to the summit. Our upcoming research is going to look at important questions around data and evidence, because this is really the bread and butter of OECD work. So the types of questions that we're planning to look at are, what does a systems approach mean for data and evidence? What should we be measuring? How can policymakers prioritize investments in data collection in a world with scarce resources? And how can new technologies be used to collect data? If we want to make better policies for food systems, we need to move from our status quo. This is clear from the report that Koen will talk about in a minute. The message I'd like to leave you with is policy reform that balances across facts, interests, and values is possible, but it's going to take effort. So my colleague Koen will highlight some of the insights from our report on how to navigate change in this complex area. All these challenges will require collective effort. So I'm really pleased to be part of this webinar, and I'm looking forward especially to the discussion with the audience to hear about experiences and ideas about how we can take food systems, how we can transform them moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liane. This was a very good and clear introduction, and offers us a perspective not only on this session, but also on the wider view. I now pass the baton. I now give the floor to Koen de Koning, our policy analyst of the OECD, who will present the findings of the report itself. Koen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll just try and share my screen. Let's see if this works. I hope you can all see the presentation now. So thank you for having us here. It's really a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to discuss with you about our report, Making Better Policies for Food Systems. And before I dive in, I think maybe it's useful that I quickly say a little bit about the OECD, because I'm not sure if all of you are equally familiar with who we are and what we do. In a nutshell, we are an international organization based in Paris. We're sometimes described by The Economist magazine as a club of mostly rich countries, which is correct. We have 37 member states who are all high-income countries and who represent a large part of the global economy. So we have 3,000 employees. Most of those are policy analysts like myself. We work on a range of issues, all the social, economic, and environmental policy issues you can think of. So this includes, say, tax evasion, education, foreign aid, and of course also food and agriculture. And our motto is better policies for better lives. And there's 3 main ways in which we try to achieve that. So the first is by informing and advising, and we strive to be a unique source of data, analysis, and insights for policymakers. A second way is by engaging and influencing, because we also bring policymakers together through our processes so they can exchange ideas, experiences, and so on. And the third way is that in some policy areas, we set standards and provide specific support. So among the many areas we work on is agriculture and food, and we've been working on these topics for many years. I just wanted to highlight a few examples to give you a taste of what we are working on. One of our reports is the Agricultural Outlook, which is a joint product with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which provides 10-year projections for global agriculture production, consumption, trade, etc. Another report, and I'll get back to this one in a second, is the Agricultural Policy Monitoring and Evaluation Report, which provides an overview of agricultural policies and subsidies around the world. And as Liane already mentioned, we have a similar exercise for fisheries. So we also have thematic work on, for example, innovation, productivity, and sustainability, on agri-environmental performance, and on agricultural resilience, to list just some of many examples. Now, these examples are all on the primary agricultural side, but we also work on the food side of things. For example, we work on finding policies that could encourage healthier food choices, asking how digital tools can improve demand-side policies, or asking how socioeconomic aspects influence food choices. So about our report itself, as Liane already mentioned, the context is that people are talking increasingly about food systems, and historically, the OECD has been doing a lot of work on what would nowadays be called food systems, but we've never called it as such. This is actually the first report by the OECD to use that term food systems. And this is partly a reflection by us on what does that term really mean. And so the term means the interconnection between agriculture, nutrition, the environment, and many other policy areas that have historically often been seen in a silo. And at the same time, we heard some alarming messages around food systems being broken. And we thought that was not a very helpful way of thinking about things, because something is either broken or it isn't. It doesn't leave a lot of room for nuance and for a more granular analysis of things. And so our report focuses on three big questions around food systems. The first one is about the actual performance of food systems, not just in terms of the challenges, but also the achievements, and importantly, about the role of policies in shaping that performance. The second set of questions have to do with the complexity of food systems. So as I mentioned, we're talking about this web of connections between different policy areas. So how should you go about to come up with coherent policies, given that complexity? And the third big set of questions that we deal with is what stands in the way of achieving better policies and how do you overcome those obstacles? This corresponds to the three core chapters of the report. And in addition to those three core chapters, we also have three detailed case studies on the seed sector, the ruminant livestock sector, and the processed food sector. And the idea here was that we wanted to look at one input sector, one primary sector, agricultural sector, and one downstream sector. And each time we've chosen the most controversial one we could find. And each case study goes into detail talking about the policy issues and different policy approaches that we've seen in OECD countries. Now, let's get started with the performance of food systems. What are we expecting from food systems anyway? I think the core of what people expect from food systems basically boils down to three main things, which we call the triple challenge. This is providing food security and nutrition for a growing global population, providing livelihoods for millions of people who are involved not only in farming and fishing, but also along other segments of the food supply chain. And thirdly, and importantly, of course, environmental sustainability. And across these three domains, we also want resilience, as the COVID-19 crisis has clearly shown. A core message of our first chapter is that across these different areas, the performance of food systems is not as black and white as people sometimes say. In fact, there are important achievements as well as serious shortcomings. And the second main message is that better policies can make a difference. And in fact, existing work by the OECD and by many others has identified several areas for improvement where better policies could lead to a better performance of food systems on these dimensions. So let's take a look at one of the achievements. If we look at how the world has changed between 1960 and today, we know that world population has more than doubled. At the same time, global food production has almost quadrupled. And this is an important achievement, and it was not at all obvious in the 1960s or 70s that the world would actually be able to achieve this. In fact, if you look at the discussions that people were having in the 60s and 70s, much of it had to do with limits to growth, with the population bomb, famine, overpopulation, and so on. So it was not a given that the food system would be able to keep pace, to just keep up with population growth, let alone expand the availability of food per person. So this is definitely an important achievement. At the same time, we all know that we are still far from achieving healthy diets for all. We've made important progress in reducing hunger and undernourishment, but still hundreds of millions of people face hunger and undernourishment. And there even seems to have been some reverse in progress in recent years. In addition, compared to the 1960s, we're also now dealing with new public health problems, notably, of course, overweight and obesity. And as this chart shows, that is not just a rich world phenomenon, it is really a global phenomenon. How about the environmental performance of food systems? Well, food systems, of course, exert important pressures on the environment in a number of dimensions. So this is definitely true for land use, for deforestation, for biodiversity loss, also for water use, for water pollution, and for global warming. So what is interesting is if we talk about the environmental damage of food systems, but across these different dimensions, most of the damage actually occurs at the agricultural production stage, by which I mean not only the farm, but also the step just before that, when land is cleared to make way for farmland, when forests, for example, are cut to make way for farmland. And historically, that was the main way in which agricultural production was increased. But something interesting happened around the 1960s. We saw a decoupling in agricultural land use. So while food production almost quadrupled, we see that land use went up by about 10 to 15%. And it's always tempting to say only 10 or 15%. But we have to keep in mind that this still means an area twice the size of Greenland. So we're still talking about a vast area that has been transformed to agricultural land. And so the environmental implications of that land use change have been significant. Still, it is clear that the food system has managed to increase the output of food per unit of land. And if that hadn't happened, the implications both for food security and for the environment would have been significantly negative. So it is interesting to ask, how did food systems achieve that increase of output per unit of land? And there's two main ways in which you could do that. The first is by using more inputs, more water, more fertilizer, more pesticides, and so on. The second method is by using existing inputs more efficiently. And between the 1960s and the 1990s, we see that actually most of the growth in global agricultural output came from using more inputs. However, after the 1990s, the story changes. And since the 1990s, and especially in recent years, it seems that efficiency gains have become the dominant source of growth in food production around the world. And this has been very good news for the environment, because it essentially means that we are achieving more outputs with the same amount of inputs, or relative to the amount of inputs we're using. Those same efficiency gains have also led to lower food prices, which is good news for consumers, but obviously imposes important challenges on farmers, especially those farmers who do not manage to keep up with productivity growth. So across a number of areas, livelihoods, environmental sustainability, food security and nutrition, we see that the global food system has some important achievements, as well as some very real and very pressing challenges. And those challenges require, of course, an effective policy response. But when we then look at the landscape of policies, we see that many of these policy efforts are simply not effective at addressing the triple challenge and often counterproductive. And here I come back to our report on agricultural policy monitoring and evaluation, which is an annual publication. So across 54 countries, which means essentially all of the OECD countries, plus all other major agricultural countries, or agricultural producers in the world, we see that annually more than $700 billion is given in support to agriculture. Now, I want to be very clear, this does not mean 700 billion in subsidies to farmers. It also includes the effects of things like protectionist trade policies, as well as investments in public goods such as research and development. But when we dig a little deeper, we see that the vast majority of the 700 billion is supporting the incomes of individual producers, and the part that is going to investments in public goods such as R&D or infrastructure is quite small. Moreover, there's more than one way in which you can try to support incomes of individual producers, but we do see that the most popular way of doing so is using the most distorting instruments, those measures which are coupled to production, which means that it creates incentives for overproduction, for using too many inputs, and it also reduces resilience by locking farmers into specific activities. So in this particular case, moving some of that support away from the most distorting measures towards less distorting measures, or even towards investments in infrastructure, in research and development, and so on, all of this would go a long way to improving the overall performance of food systems. So in this particular example, it's actually relatively straightforward to come up with policy recommendations, but that is not generally the case. In fact, in general, food systems are very complex because of the many possible interactions and spillover effects between different policy domains. So it's natural for policymakers, when they are faced with this complexity, to feel overwhelmed and to wonder how on earth they could achieve anything resembling coherent policies. So this is the topic of our second chapter. And our basic philosophy is, given this complexity, we should try to make things as simple as possible, but not any simpler. And in that spirit, we derived some pragmatic principles for greater policy coherence. And the first one is that policymakers, when they are thinking about new initiatives, they should be aware of possible synergies and trade-offs with other policy areas. And this may seem trivial, but unfortunately, we all know that historically many policies have been made in silos without taking into account some of these spillover effects. There is, however, an important follow-up to that point, which is that it's not enough to simply be aware or speculate about possible spillover effects. We also need to rigorously evaluate them, because not all possible effects are real or big enough to matter. To give one specific example here, in popular discussions, you will often hear that farm subsidies have contributed to obesity, and what people have in mind is that farm subsidies make food cheaper and therefore people eat more food. In reality, most of the policies to support farmers actually raise the price of food. So the evidence says that actually the impact of agricultural policies was probably not as big as many people have in mind. So it's important that we scrutinize these hypotheses about possible spillover effects if we want to design effective policies. Third, sometimes people have a tendency to talk about synergies and trade-offs between policy areas as if they are set in stone. And we want to warn against thinking like that. In fact, synergies and trade-offs are not set in stone. They actually depend strongly on the specific policy instruments you choose. To give one example here, if you use a fertilizer subsidy to give income support to farmers, clearly this will stimulate overuse of fertilizer by farmers. So in that specific case, there might be a trade-off or a tension between helping the farmer and helping the environment. But that is clearly just because of the specific choice of policy instrument. And so if you change to a different policy instrument, you could easily imagine reducing that trade-off or even turning it into a synergy. For example, if you would pay the farmer instead for ecosystem services. So thinking about the choice of policy instruments is important, and a smarter choice of policy instruments can often avoid painful trade-offs or at least reduce them. Fourth, when there are synergies, we sometimes see people get carried away when there are certain synergies. For example, we know that the shift towards healthier diets could have important environmental co-benefits. But people sometimes get carried away, and it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that one instrument is usually not sufficient to meet several goals. So even if there are important co-benefits, we need to think in terms of a policy mix rather than focusing on the one policy, a silver bullet that would somehow fix many different issues at once. And finally, we also have a principle involving trade-offs. When there are trade-offs, resolving those trade-offs is not just a technical question. Of course, we need to have the best possible technical analysis to understand what exactly the trade-off is. But when there is a choice to be made, that choice always involves some value judgments, and different societies can come up with different answers about how they want to resolve those trade-offs. So it's important to keep in mind that this involves a societal choice. Now, hopefully those principles go some way to reducing the complexity of policymaking in food systems, but we all know that complexity is not the only thing that stands in the way of better policies for food systems. And so our third chapter zooms in on those obstacles and how we could overcome them. And the way we like to think about it is that policymaking is made difficult by disagreements over facts, interests, and values. Now, there is a lot we know about food systems, but there is also still a lot that is not known about food systems. And this, for example, in many areas, we may have information about the problem, but we don't always understand the causal mechanisms or the effectiveness of different policy options. In addition, in many cases, there are gaps between public perception and the evidence. So the key point here is that it's really essential that we build a shared understanding of the facts. And in our chapter, we propose several good practices, and one of them is to make use of scientific advisory councils. So it's really important that, that these generate trusted advice, trusted scientific evidence, and that this can feed into the policy process. At the same time, the facts tell us how the world is, they don't tell us how the world should be. So this is again where this aspect of societal choice comes into play. Interests and values are important in that regard. So interests, of course, play an important role because any policy change will create winners and losers. And those groups that are affected by a policy change, of course, then have an incentive to try and lobby the government to move the policy in their preferred direction. And by itself, that lobbying process is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, lobbying can be a very valuable tool for governments to find out how different stakeholders are really affected by a proposed change. Where things go wrong is if certain interest groups, certain stakeholders have a louder voice than others, when they have a privileged position in that process, or especially when some groups are simply not heard at all. So it is really important that policy processes promote accountability, transparency, and the level playing field to make sure that all stakeholders have a chance to be heard. And the OECD has a wide range of recommendations and good practices to make sure that policy processes meet those criteria. Discussions on food systems will often talk about the facts and the interests, but there is a third component that we feel has not received as much attention as it should, and that is the role of values. Many policy issues in food systems actually have a very strong value dimension. So for example, if you take a debate like the GMO debate, ostensibly this is about the health, environmental, and productivity effects of a new technology. But in reality, there's a lot more going on than that. So some people are opposed to the technology because they don't trust large corporations. Some people are opposed to the technology because they want to protect a more traditional way of farming. Others might think that it is simply unethical to play God with genetics. So clearly, these value differences are important and they come into play in many policy discussions around food systems. Now, what is important here is that, in a sense, value differences are much harder to resolve in theory than differences over facts or differences over interests. At least in theory, for differences over facts, we could do more research and gather more evidence. For differences over interests, at least in theory, it might be possible to find a way to compensate the losers of a reform to overcome their opposition. But it's not clear how you would apply those techniques in the case of differences over values. In fact, it's almost by definition true for a value that it is not something that you are willing to give up in exchange for something else. So that means that if there is really a strong difference in values in society, the problem faced for policymakers is quite tricky. Now, there are some ways that you could move forward on these debates. One possible method is by thinking creatively about adjusting the specific policy that is proposed so that it becomes acceptable to people with very different values. Sometimes this is possible, and of course, if it is possible, this is clearly the preferred option. Unfortunately, it's not always possible to find such creative solutions to value differences, so sometimes we simply need to make a choice as a society. And one interesting technique that is increasingly used and which OECD has explored in a recent report is to make these difficult decisions through deliberative processes. For example, where you take a random sample of 100 citizens and you have them engage in facilitated discussions with experts and with themselves, and then they make a recommendation to the government. This has been used successfully to cut through some very thorny ethical issues in a number of countries. And we will have a webinar this Thursday to explore how these deliberative processes could also be used for food systems. So this, in a nutshell, is the report on making better policies for food systems. And you will have noticed that we spend a lot of time talking not just about the what, but also about the how of making better policies for food systems. And that is not a coincidence. We know that food systems are highly diverse, which makes it difficult to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution to things. At the same time, it is important that whatever process is used, that there is a robust process that can take the best available evidence, that can balance different interests, and that can overcome value differences so that policies can be tailored to local circumstances, but still balance the facts, the interests, and the values. So I want to finish by saying a few words about the UN Food Systems Summit. As you probably are aware, there is a summit happening in September this year on food systems. And this is already proving to be a catalyst for policy discussions on food systems at the global and national level, and also in many cases, the sub-national level. And the OECD is committed to contributing its expertise on food systems to this discussion. We have a lot of expertise in areas such as agriculture and poverty reduction, innovation, obesity, food security, resilience, land use, rural well-being, and so on. And much of this research is synthesized in our report, Making Better Policies for Food Systems. But we've also now created a portal page, you can find the URL there, which is a gateway to all of the work that we have done on food systems. And of course, if you have any other questions on food systems, feel free to contact us on the email address shown here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Koen. And at the same time, thank you very much for the invitation to visit your website and explore all the material that the OECD has to offer in this question. I think your introduction was very informative to the report, and you have put a lot of accents in it. So you have helped us to find our way in the wide range of insights that you have been offering. It's very nice. Now we will be opening the discussion a bit by offering reflections by representatives of the EEAC member councils. And as you remember, I said the main question was, what are the possible implications of the findings of the report for individual member states, EU member states, or regions? And this is very interesting, I think, because we all will be drafting or will be involved in drafting of national plans and strategies for the implementation of the new edition of the CAP in the next 6 months. So we can take in this material, these insights that have been offered when advising on our national plan or our regional plan. So I invite 3 distinguished members of the councils for comment. And first I want to give the floor to Professor Marcus Fischer on behalf of the WBGU. Marcus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. WBGU is not a North American radio station, as the acronym might suggest, but it's actually the German Advisory Council on Global Change, and I'm a member, and I'm happy to speak on behalf of that council. So first, congratulations for a very substantial and important report. My reflection comes in three parts. I would shortly tell you where I come from, then give some comments on the report, and then reflect on what individual countries can do. So our council has issued a report about land, how we deal with land. It's entitled Rethinking Land in the Anthropocene, from Separation to Integration. I put a link into the chat, maybe that can be forwarded to everyone. And that report was actually starting out from the same triple challenge, which we call the trilemma. And we came up with 5 multiple benefit strategies to overcome that. And 2 of these 5 were actually directly mirroring your report. One was sustainable farming systems, where we also differentiated between temperate and developed country systems versus tropical and, for example, sub-Saharan systems. And the second multiple benefit strategy was on the sustainable consumption, diets, avoiding food waste, and so forth. But we also had further multiple benefit strategies, and 2 important ones of these were conservation of biodiversity and also restoration. Because obviously there is a conflict for land, but also there is many benefits from conservation and restoration, for example, in water provision, in pollination, in pest control, and so forth for agriculture. And we also pointed out 5 governance strategies for implementations, which might be interesting. The first one was to support pioneers of change. So pioneers doing something useful in food systems that can be scaled up. Then the second one concerns the proactive state. I will come back to that later. The third one concerns the EU and other similar unions. I will also come back to that later. The fourth one.
Marcus, can you point a bit clearer to the microphone? Because when you don't speak to the microphone, you're not always very clear.
Yeah, thank you for the hint. I will. So international cooperation strengthening, and then finally new cooperation alliances. So against this background, a few comments on the report and then what individual countries can do. So again, congratulations, very thorough. Fully agree that this trade-off is extremely relevant. I also fully agree that production is not the main problem. I mean, the amount of production, I think that's very important to state that. Very many people are not aware of that. So it's not the main problem. I agree with that. Agree with that it's a holistic vision is needed. And I think addressing food systems, which is integrating production and consumption and combining that with policy making and coherence, is directly to the point, because this is where we can take action. So I really want to congratulate you for that. It offers great opportunities. Now, concerning your initial chapters 1, 2, 3, I agree that policy mixes and mixes of instruments are the way to go. That is true. And I think it couldn't be emphasized more that ambition is actually really needed. Ambition is lacking currently, and I fully agree with what you're saying there. Concerning cross-sectoral approaches, yes, I think the participatory approaches could have even been emphasized more. You're stating multiple perspectives should be acknowledged, multiple values should be acknowledged. I agree with that. I think from a scientific assessment point of view, we would think that a little bit more of a normative element could also be derived from a number of perspectives. One is the governments have already decided that they want to achieve the SDGs, for example, or that they want to achieve some strategies around food or the environment. So we can use the if-then logic. If you follow this pathway, then you will never go there. But if you follow the other pathway, you will get there. And I think you could have made that a bit stronger. I think that point. It's not only about leaving it open and negotiating between interests. It also has a little bit of there is already a normative framework, if you want. So I think that should be emphasized more. In that context, it's also interesting that there's a lot of money in the agricultural policy, as you pointed out, and many countries and the EU are somehow delegating many social goals and also environmental goals to the agricultural policy, deliberately or not. But in fact, it has such a big impact. And I think with that also comes a big responsibility. And I think that could have been pointed out a bit more clearly. Concerning your three specific issues with the seed sector, I agree that the rights issue, the participation issues are very interesting there. Concerning ruminant livestock, maybe distinguishing between mountain countries or countries where you can hardly do anything else rather than having ruminant livestock, and countries where you have more choice could maybe be helpful as a distinction also. And with the processed food, I agree it's very important to integrate health with other issues, environmental concerns and so forth. So I think these are all very important, but it's not comprehensive. So I would like to see them integrated with other topics, and ideally seeing integrated scenarios, integrated pathways. How do we finally achieve at sustainable food systems and not only see the individual elements? Now, what can individual countries do? I have 6 short points here. The one is definitely be more ambitious, be ambitious. Business as usual is no option, we know that. We have great options, it is urgent, so be ambitious. The second is stop externalizing costs of unsustainable food systems. So that involves a number of instruments, accounting, taxes, subsidies, tariffs, incentives. So stop externalizing costs. The third one is drastically reduce food waste. The fourth one is consider the full multifunctionality of food systems in the context of land and the environment. It is not only about food systems and their functions, but it's also about the environmental and other impacts that the food systems have. And that involves a responsibility. You could say having the privilege to deal with food and to deal with land also comes with a responsibility for all the other functions that land should actually really deliver. And I think that should be pointed out more clearly in national policies. Similarly, my 5th point, consider the multifunctionality of food systems in the context of human well-being and quality of life. So it's about health, it's about social cohesion, it's about culture, and so forth. And that should lead to more integrated food system policies. As I should have mentioned earlier, with the multifunctionality of in the context of land, there should also be more integrated ecosystem policies. So having a separate agricultural policy is not always the best idea, I think. Then my final point F, or number 6, is strengthen existing international cooperation. If I look at the Food Summit, yes, highly important, but we will also have the COPs of the Convention on Biodiversity, we will have the Climate COP, and they all act in separation. So there should be collaboration between all these bodies, and that only comes about if all the countries push for it. So please push for it. And if you cannot take everyone along, you can also start new coalitions of the willing. Few countries can initiate something and then others can follow. And finally, COVID responses are underway. There is also a lot of money in the system. Make use of that along the lines of of what has been said. So I conclude by congratulating you again, and by also suggesting to integrate it even further, to integrate the food system in the bigger land and further systems. So thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak, and thanks for your interest.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for this. I congratulate you for your excellent comments. I propose that I will give, after this first round with André and Arno, the floor back to the people of the OECD, Leanne, Koen, or Ellie, to have a first reaction on the reactions, and then proceed to the questions and the discussion. So now I give the floor to André van der Zande. As I said, he has a rich career in Dutch food policy, etc., and he's member of the Dutch Council for Environment and Infrastructure. André, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I have some slides, only a few, to help me and to help you to remember it. Oh, this is the council I am member of. So second slide, please. And I give you my reflections, and reflections are also to be understood as work still to be done. So first of all, I think I can echo the compliments. We think it's a oh, sorry, the earlier one. And now the second? No. Well, sorry. No. Back, please. Well, yeah, there's one missing. I'll do it then. Just speaking, because this was the slide where I said it is a very comprehensive report with a well-chosen scope, a scope with integrated policies for food systems. And this is not new. And we have some experience with it in the Netherlands. In 2014, our Scientific Advisory Council for the Cabinet did a tentative report, also advocating the breakthrough of the three silos and connecting the three challenges or the three domains or pillars, whatever you want to call them: food, nutrition, farmers, agriculture, and the environment. Our own council did a report on sustainable and healthy, working together towards a sustainable food system in 2018. And I see a comparable line of thought. It's not as fast and as encompassing, of course, as the OECD work, but the line of reasoning is the same. We did a little bit more advice than analysis, and that's one of the points I come back to. So yes, very thorough, very well documented, impressive footnote lists and references. So it's a treasure for all people who want to get acquainted with all the dilemmas in this field. And finally, a compliment is that it is in line with the SDG approach, of course, but also with new approaches in economy where we deal with in the Netherlands, like what we call the broad prosperity approaches as a complement to the GDP and the other approaches. So these are, I think, the very positive points worth a compliment. However, I have 3 points of reflections. And first of it is what Koen said. There is not a broken system, there is not a system failure. And I am very curious, what is the definition of Koen of what is a system failure? Because in my words, if you keep doing what you did, you get what you got. And I think this is not what the report contains of very alarming and dramatic conclusions and data. The stunning figures on obesity, undernourishment, the biodiversity and climate disaster, the not stable livelihoods for farmers. I think all the indicators are very, very alarming. And well, I think perhaps it was diplomatically necessary to give some compliments to the achievements, but I think when we look to the future, it is a very grim and dramatic situation. So I think what our feeling is that yes, we need a system change. And there are lots of points in the report. I quote here some pages where you have conclusions that you said there are wide gaps or there are great failures. So I think the substantiated conclusion we draw from this report is that there is a system change and transformative changes are necessary, a paradigm shift. And I think that should be the real strategic advice, and that leads to more urgency. Now we have a very, very well documented report, but the urgency waters down the more you read. And I think the message could be and should be clearer on that. My second point, second sheet, please. That is the conceptual framework of the report is that you try to connect the three challenges, analyzing synergies and trade-offs. And we think that is only a beginning for understanding the system. Koen had one very complex, almost ridiculous picture of all the connections. I think you need a more concepts for how the system in the three pillars and challenges is working in itself. So we need an analysis on the system level and not only on the many myriads of cause and effect relations within the three pillars and between the pillars. I think you need a conception of how the system works. And of course, this is only one.
And Andre, you muted yourself, I suppose. You have to open your mic again.
Ah, yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, thank you. I think, for example, the transaction space for food and agriculture production will be determined by planetary boundaries. The carrying capacity of the planet is finite. We think the free trade will not flourish without elements of social justice. And yes, I agree, the Sustainable Development Goals has this normative element, what we should achieve there. So there are social boundaries. So I don't think are three equal challenges and look at the trade-offs and synergies and then you can make improvements. You should have a conceptual framework and I think this is still work to be done. And that does not mean that Kate Raworth's analysis is the only option, but well, options like that should be considered. And another point is it better policies? Do we get it from better tools or from better inspiration, better goals, more ambition? So I think the balance between an incremental improvement of policy instruments versus a paradigm shift with a new narrative, a narrative which is laden with this urgency, I think is necessary. And this is, of course, perhaps not the heart of the OECD approach, but I think you should recognize that when you're talking about system change, transformative change, you also need a narrative side and have to appeal to other elements of society. You have to incorporate other kinds of economics, for example, behavioral economics and institutional economics. So I think that should complement the already very rich data and information in the report that are there. And my final and third reflection is on the action perspective. In the Netherlands right now, a cabinet is being formed. And I was wondering myself, what is the takeaway message for a new cabinet from this report for the new Minister for Food, if there would be a Minister for Food? I don't think so. There will be 5 parties, so there will be, I think, perhaps 8 ministers and junior ministers involved in this whole complex, more and more even instead of less. So the whole appeal to bring the policy in one hand is not getting easier nowadays in this splintered political landscape we have in the Netherlands. I think there is recognition in the report that that the problem is not that we do not know what could and should be done. The problem is there are very strong conflicting interests preventing and conflicting values preventing what we should do. And you call it policy capture. And your answer is create a level playing field for the weaker interests. And that is easily said on paper. Well, I welcome the examples in the report, like the Irish approach and several other examples, but it's only a handful of very fresh and tentative experiments in the policy approach. So you have a very weak new instrument opposing very solid and very well, hard and harsh interest lobbies. This is my feeling of not being in balance. Is there another way? I don't think so. Even in the Netherlands, we are experimenting with a G1000, it is called, a citizen parliament with 1,000 persons carefully selected, and they have to deal with our, well, unsolvable wicked problems the politicians themselves cannot solve. So this is, I think, the way to go. But, well, we should be more, I think, alarming about the fact that these interests, differences, these policy captures are not that easily broken. And I want to mention one other best practice where Netherlands has been instrumental, that is for natural capital accounting. If you want to work with the planetary boundaries approach and you want to make calculations, you want to make policy analysis, you have to have good data and statistics. And it is very good that the new accounting standards for natural capital accounting have been published just the other day. So in the whole ex ante analysis for policy proposals, you can now calculate natural capital in the equation, which is, I think, very promising and very exciting, at least for me as an ecologist. So in conclusion, I think there is a very good basis for improving on the wide scope idea of food policies. I think we have a very tough cookie. I think the analysis part is okay and could be improved, but the urgency should have a narrative of, I think, alarming necessity, because I really think, for example, the Paris agreements in the Netherlands, we can't meet them with agriculture and food policy as we have it now. And that's, I think, why the cabinet formation on this point will take months, because they have to make very, very harsh decisions. And I think the Netherlands is not an exception to that. So if you take them seriously, and you want to avoid courts, because NGOs don't use evidence anymore, they go to court and they make the judges obey the cabinets and the politicians. This is the reality, and I think firms already did this before the NGOs did. So this is, I think, the political context where this report, it's a highly political field, but, well, we are optimists like myself, and I welcome the initiative, and I welcome your building block for this UN summit. I think this will be a very fantastic building block. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, André. Again, after the 6 advices of Marcus, 3 fundamental critiques, very fundamental comments, very fruitful. It's very fitting that we should give the floor back to the OECD after these comments. But first, I give the floor to Arno as 3rd comment from Catalonia. Arno, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you for the invitation to share our views on this very important topic at the international level, in Europe, but also obviously in Catalonia at the regional level. So first of all, on behalf of my council, I would like to congratulate the OECD for the report that focus on the key role that food system play to achieve the SDGs. And you know, I think that everyone is aware that food systems have been identified as one of the 6 big transformations needed to achieve the SDGs at the global level. We have this is stated in the Global Sustainable Development Report 2019. This is one of the 6 transformations proposed by Jeffrey Sachs, Mariano Mazzucato, Dirk Messner, and Johan Rockström, or for instance, it is also included in the World Scientist warning of a climate emergency. And besides these excellent contributions by the OECD, some days ago, the IPES Food issued a new report, which is the title of the report is "A Long Food Movement Transforming Food Systems by 2045." That shows that that the social model defines food systems and the food systems from human development. The good news is that at the end, as the OECD report already recognizes, is that there is a growing demand for a more holistic food system approach. And this is one of the main successful news from today, the good news. The point is that this report and these requests coming from academia and from many experts, the challenges remain. And the point is that, as the OECD report states, and I think that the previous speakers already mentioned this. We are making better policies for food systems. It requires not only, technical aspects or technical measures, but dealing with diverging interests and different values. And this means at the end, different visions on food systems and food policies in an open world with some global and European rules that affect the shift towards more sustainable food systems at the local, regional, and national level. So here, in that context, I would like to highlight the report that the Advisory Council for Sustainable Development of Catalonia issued in 2018. The title of this report is Feeding on Future. And it was in that report, we wanted to make sure that the entire government, not only the ministry that traditionally leads the food policy, but all ministries, including, for instance, the Ministry for Education and Health, were aware of the strategic importance of food. And this is what the main point that we stress it in our report, where we analyze it, the main challenges facing Catalonia in order to guarantee in the mid and long term that our population has access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preference for an active and healthy lifestyle while enhancing environmental sustainability. I think that you may find some common points with the OECD report. But one of our conclusions in that report, but also coming from the OECD report and the different previous interventions, is that we are dealing with complexity. As I mentioned before, different visions, different needs, diverse interests, and priorities that need to be confronted, discussed, but at the end managed by not only by governments, but for the wide community of stakeholders. And this was also one of the points that we stated in our report. And the main recommendations to the government were to, first of all, be sure that, or try to maintain the production capacity of the food system. This means we need agricultural land ready to be, used by food production. That means a strategic change on the vision we have about land. This confrontation between the industrial and the, why do we give more weight to urban and industrial land when food needs will be a strategic, the food will be a strategic need for our population. Then we also recommended to increase food productivity and take into account that we need to be circular. We have serious constraints in terms of water and nutrients, and that, for instance, we are losing biodiversity that is useful, and it's necessary for providing some ecosystemic services that needs to be used for food production. But also we have a long-standing debate on the use of water and the confrontation between different uses. We also put on the table of the government that climate change is a serious constraint. We are losing, climate change is here. Our projections say that rain will reduce by 10% across the country, but significant reductions will be in the river headwaters. We are going to have some problems regarding water for irrigation. Evapotranspiration will increase, the soils will lose fertility, and we cannot talk about food policy without dealing with the serious climate change consequences. we have, I mean, there are some people in Catalonia with that have difficulties to access to food, but at the same time we have the 34.6% which are overweighted, and 14 more or less percent are obese. So this is also a problem that needs to be taken into account when talking about food policy. At the end, what we have a series of recommendations, but what we highly recommended to the government was to boost the national agreement for food policy, and also we asked the government to design and implement an integrated food strategy covering all actors, all sectors, and this is the main point that we put there, and we put a lot of stress on this governance point of view. And this is I think, I'm sure that this is one of the greatest difficulties. Actually, the government created a National Council for Food Policy. It's important, is the place where the government, research institutions, local governments, and a variety of stakeholders discuss the food policy in Catalonia. In February this year, February 21st, the government approved this strategy, this strategic plan for food. I mean, covering a wide range of issues. So from that part, I mean, it's not consequence of our report, but we need to be sure that we have some excellent instruments in place. I mean, the plan and the place where we discuss and we boost the implementation of the measures included in the plan. Now, for us, the challenge is the real transversality of the implementation. I mean, the document is transversal. Everyone is in the council, everyone is in place, but the point is, how do we manage the concrete trade-offs we have between territorial and urban policy, energy transition that, I mean, I don't know in other countries, but here we have the implementation of new, of renewable energies in rural areas. And this is a confrontation, it is a conflict with food productivity. But the point is that we all are, I mean, all actors involved in energy transition, in food policy, support the transitions to a more sustainable country in a more sustainable planet. So this is a confrontation between interest and people working for the same purpose, which is a transition towards sustainable development. But there is a confrontation between uses, and this is a point. And the point is how this strategic plan for food links or relates, for instance, with the new biodiversity strategy for 2030, etc., etc., etc. So again, we have instruments now. We need to implement, and then the other point is how we deal with this diversity of visions coming from the government to consumers to all. I mean, we have different visions, different models in all the value chain, or in all the chain, in all the food chain, and this is one of them. To conclude, I think that, as the OECD report says, we have this is a growing demand on the, at least we have understood the importance of moving from agriculture, livestock, and fisheries policies to a food system, to an integrated food policy. But still, when we go into details, challenges remain in a more concrete point. This would be my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arno. In fact, you have, in a way, been building further on what André said by giving concrete governance example and how you handle it in Catalonia. It was very interesting. I now give the floor to Lee-Anne or Koen or whoever to have a first reaction. Lee-Anne?
I'll jump in quickly, and then I'm sure Koen and Ellie have more to say. So I had three themes that kind of jumped out at me listening to Marcus, Andre, and Arno. And thank you very much for your robust and thoughtful remarks. It's really useful for us to listen to people reflect on the report and also to talk about the challenges for your particular situation, because a lot of our report is sort of trying to set a framework that can then be applied in many different kinds of situations. So it's very rich for us to hear your comments. So maybe just picking up on this question of, is it a failed system or not? One of the choices we made early on for this report was that we were not going to admire the problem. We wanted to move from looking at the specifics of the problem and contextualizing where there were challenges, but also kind of highlighting where there were some successes, and move towards something that could be more actionable. So move towards process. So the bulk of the report is really talking about framing issues around food systems and then thinking about the policy processes that policymakers can use. And the kind of feedback we've been getting from our delegates at the OECD, for example, is that it's quite useful to have these rules of thumb. So little things like the food systems and the triple challenge, so that you can highlight to your senior people a clear communication around those, it's 3 areas: it's food, it's environment, and it's livelihoods, or frictions around facts, interests, and values, right? So you can talk to your senior officials around needing to think about those things, and it's not delving into the complexity that everyone in this webinar appreciates. So it's it's also a communication tool. So the second point I wanted to make, and again, this was a topic that all 3 commentators made, this issue of international cooperation. And I would extend it beyond governmental cooperation, but also for governments to think about what the role of the private sector is. So we know that there needs to be different kinds of roles, but the public sector is also going to play a key role in the food systems transformation. So thinking about how to engage with them, for example, around questions around data, which is our next project. At what point do governments need to take action, and at what point can private sector actually help in terms of taking on some of this collection of data and evidence that we're going to need if we are going to move food systems in a good direction. And finally, the last theme that jumped out at me was about implementation and action. So I thought all 3 commentators touched on this, and I think Andre used the word experimentation. I think what's really important is, as we think about what it takes to transform a system, we also need to be thinking about how to try new things, but also how to observe what we're trying, so that we're thinking about what kinds of information we're learning through our process, so then we can change the process in the next round to make it even better. And again, the OECD is thinking a lot about that, and we have some colleagues who are working, for example, on deliberative processes, where they've looked at country experiences running citizens' assemblies in a bunch of different situations. And we're going to have a webinar later this week that actually digs into that. So that's it for me, but I'll pass it on to maybe to Koen first, and then Ellie if she wants to add in.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So many of the points that I wanted to make have already been made by Leanne, so I'm just trying to think what I can add. No, let me just start by saying this is really honestly true. These are some of the most thoughtful reflections that I've heard so far on this report, and I've been in many webinars about it so far. So thank you very much for that. We knew we were going to have a good debate, and you did not disappoint. So that's really great. I also find myself agreeing with most of it, even where it's framed as a criticism. So I'm not sure what to make of that. So maybe to build on what Leanne already mentioned, I think for us and the OECD at least, this report on food systems is first a starting point, not an end point. So all these reflections have been really great and really challenge us to continue thinking further along these lines and encourage us to continue along this line. Another thing is, while we were thinking about food systems, I showed this complex chart, and I'm sure all of you have seen versions of that chart where people try to map the food system or try to make a diagram showing the entire food system. And inevitably, no matter how complex you make that chart, there's always at least one thing that is not on that chart. So you can always find some aspect that isn't there And even if you would have captured all the elements, their importance would vary depending on local conditions, etc. So this was also one of the insights while making this report, is that food systems, in a sense, it's less a map of the landscape and more a way of looking at something. And a way of looking at emphasizes the importance of thinking about these synergies and trade-offs, these interconnections, these spillovers between different policy domains, as well as thinking about the lens of facts, interests, and values. So as Leanne mentioned, we do notice in our discussions with policymakers that they find it really useful as a heuristic to make sense of a complex reality, that there's a couple of rules of thumb like that help them to look at the problem in a certain way. And for example, I find myself agreeing with André, and I really I very much appreciate you emphasizing the importance of the sense of urgency. And I can see why maybe while looking at our report, you might feel that is not sufficiently developed. But we do agree with that sense of urgency, maybe if we didn't bring it out sufficiently in this report. And I've also been thinking about your comment about the planetary boundaries and the donut chart, the Kate Raworth chart. So I'm maybe less sure about the part that Raworth added herself, the inside circle, but definitely the outside circle, the Rockstrom work on planetary boundaries is at least implicitly was in our minds while doing this. And it is still the case. So maybe the language of trade-offs makes it seem as if there's a lot of choice and a lot of possibilities there. And you want to emphasize, well, actually, there are some hard constraints. You know, if we're messing with nitrogen cycles, if we're messing with biodiversity, and especially with greenhouse gas emissions, there are some hard boundaries about what you can do, which is absolutely true. So we didn't mean to imply that everything is just a choice and we can do whatever we want. There are certain constraints, but it is still the case that still translate into specific trade-offs, especially once you start thinking at local conditions. So one example I have in mind is during the oil palm boom, there was a large amount of deforestation happening in Malaysia and Indonesia. So clearly from an environmental or a global point of view, this was not a very positive development. At the same time, the research also suggests that this has really had very positive effects on poverty among smallholder farmers. So even if at a global point of view, you could say this is clearly going in the wrong direction in terms of planetary boundaries, it's still the case that for local policymakers, that trade-off is still very real. So even if we're pushing against the planetary boundary and we're really pushing against the hard constraint, the reality is that those trade-offs exist, at least in the view of policymakers and the stakeholders themselves. So that's why we felt that this was a useful language to introduce there. There's another aspect is, you mentioned, André, the role of interest and values. And I also really appreciated Marcus's point that actually a lot of the normative things have already been settled, or we have already decided as a society on things like the Sustainable Development Goals, the UNFCCC, many other international treaties that already sort of put in place the normative framework. So I think that's a very good point actually, and it might be worth for us to draw that out a little bit more in future work to highlight that policymakers have already, or societies have already signed up to certain normative commitments, and that therefore certain things actually simply follow from that. I think that's a very good point. Still, of course, there's a lot of room for asking about, again, this question of implementation at a more local level. And one thing there is our perspectives of facts, interests, and values is because while talking with different people tend to emphasize different aspects. So some people would say, well, we just need more research. And if you just let us do a little bit more research, we can enlighten the policymakers and then everything else will follow from that. And I think I don't need to explain to this audience that that's not always how it works. Other people might say, well, it's all just interest groups. It's all just lobby groups who are blocking things. Well, there's truth to that. And then there's other people who would say, well, actually, we should have bottom-up stakeholder processes. We bring people around the table and we just discuss things and we have buy-in from all the stakeholders. And I think, well, that's nice, but don't forget that if you bring all the stakeholders around the table, there are also certain interests there. And it's kind of hard to make people agree on something if that means a very big reduction in their own well-being or their own welfare. So that's why we thought having the three of them together, the different policy issues in different places will have will hit more the constraint of facts or interests or values. The worst outcome is when you have disagreements on all three, or when they start to spill over into each other, then you get really intractable policy problems or controversies. But there are examples where we may all sort of agree on something, but then the real constraint is still on the facts. So food loss and waste was mentioned by several people. It's actually a good example. So at the high level, we sort of know that it's a large share of total food production that is lost. The exact number is not that clear, but it must be in the order of 20 to 30%. And there's different ways that we can triangulate that. And we know that globally, that's roughly the number. But then we have maybe 10, 15 years of discussion about how big that number is. And we all sort of agree that it's large and important. And if we could do something about that, it would have very good synergies for many of the outcomes that we care about in terms of the triple challenge. But then once you start to ask, okay, what are the actual policies at work to do something about that? Then suddenly we know very little. So there was a recent report by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission that actually made an overview of different kinds of interventions. And they say that for many of these interventions, actually, I think the majority of the interventions, there was not even an estimate of the baseline in terms of food loss and waste, which basically means that it's really hard to say anything about the effectiveness of those measures. And there's even a question then, even if you would find something working in a pilot, can you then scale it up if you remove the observer effect, right? If you don't have somebody with a clipboard standing next to you in the kitchen. So there's all these questions about effectiveness of policies. Instead, that's partly what inspired the idea that we should look a little bit more deeply into these data gaps or evidence gaps. So not to say that interest and values are unimportant. There's a reason we put them there. But starting with the facts, there's actually quite a bit we know, but there's still a lot we don't know, especially when it comes to the effectiveness of specific policies. And that also includes the specific synergies and trade-offs associated with specific policy instruments. There's actually a lot there that we don't really know. So maybe I will stop there. I just wanted to, those were just some of the things that came to mind now. And as I mentioned, I actually agreed with the vast majority of what everybody here said. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Koen.
Maybe one more point though, is that
one more point.
Arnaud,
okay.
Yes, very briefly. Arnaud mentioned national food policy. And actually, there's different countries that have been going in that direction. Canada is one of them. And so on the 4th of May, so I already mentioned our webinar this Thursday on deliberative processes. We'll have another webinar on the 4th of May, specifically on this question of national food policies or national food strategies. So if that is of interest, that's also an open invitation. I think Ellie may want to say a bit more about that.
Yes, there's a lot of interest in the webinars. I have noted in the chat. Ellie?
Thank you very much. Actually, yes, Koen, I was going to put a plug in there for our webinar series. So part of what our report does that other reports don't do in the food system conversation, which is getting quite crowded with a lot of the international organizations producing reports particularly, and this space will become even more crowded as we lead up into the UN Food System Summit. What our report does is does these sort of deep dives on how to, and emphasizing the technical possibilities to encourage policy coherence. And so I think this is really puts us sort of apart. I've welcomed all the comments that we've received from the speakers and have noted down so many of your examples. So yes, just to backtrack, we will be holding a webinar on how to design and implement a national food systems policy. And we will have interventions from the Canadians who are now in the implementation phase of their national food strategy, and the UK policymakers who are in that initial phases and are about to release their strategy. So I think that that could be of interest for you all to, and I will keep you posted about the dates. That's going to take place on the 4th of May. And yeah, one of the things that I noticed was when Jan introduced us to talk about the fact that there are the national plans that are in the process of being developed. And I'd be really interested to hear about the council and your and participants in this room, how you feed into that process, because as was mentioned by Marcus and Arnaud and Andre, governments have agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I really liked the comment that was "if then." and we're not on track to meeting those goals. So how does subsequent policy and national programs feed into meeting those goals? And also what we have learnt through the work on food systems is that the data doesn't exist. And even in OECD countries, rich countries can't report on some of those SDG goals, for instance, food insecurity. We have a lot of countries, and we found out when a recent paper that was recently released on the socioeconomic aspects of food insecurity and nutrition, OECD countries can't say how many of their population are food insecure. So this is part of that's an SDG goal, and the information isn't there. So that feeds into our next project, which is about data gaps. I was really excited to hear that the Netherlands have this database on natural capital, and my colleagues in the other team of the Trade and Agriculture Directorate have told me how good data is, the Netherlands data is. And so yes, obviously that is, and that's the case, and there's more recent data, as Andre has just mentioned, so we'll have to have a look at that feeding into our data gaps report. I was really interested, Arno, of your comment about implementation of natural food, of national strategies. It's hard, and that's what we hear from the Canadians. It is hard to work across agencies and to work across topics. And traditionally these were in silos. So we had our agriculture policy, and we had our climate change policy, and then we had our conservation policy. But we have to work across now, and it's really difficult. And in our case in the OECD, what we did is when we were developing this report, we decided to walk the walk and get to meet our colleagues in the other parts of the organization. And as you will have seen from Koen's presentations, there's 30,000 people that work at the OECD. And so we decided to talk with the different parts of the organization about what they think about what good governance looks like, and what environmental situation and water and rural policy, and so and health and obesity policies. And so we would get in, we spent a lot of time when we could meet in person, having coffees with our colleagues and getting to know them. And the research is much richer because of that, because we draw in the resources from across the organization to tell the story of policy coherence. So I'm really excited to hear about the Catalan example on this national food policy, and I'll look, be in touch with you, Arno, to hear some more about that. Yeah, I think I'm getting to the end of my, there's one part, Marcus, you made the comment about stewardship. Well, I heard it was stewardship, the need to internalize externalities, and that farm or working on the land, there is responsibility that goes with that in terms of biodiversity, the multifunctionality of the agriculture sector, which includes rural welfare and health outcomes. This isn't something we hear a lot about in agriculture policy. We don't hear a lot about food is consumed and it has health impacts. We know more and more about the environmental impacts of food, but the health impacts of agriculture policies, it's something that we don't know a lot about. And in our recent work on socioeconomic determinants, and also a project that we had on digital and how to use digital tools for sustainable food choices, but also data collection, food data collection, we know that there is so much we don't know on what consumers eat. What do people actually eat? So how to make a food policy when you don't know what people are eating to begin with, what they buy on a weekly basis, and the cost of the price of their food basket, you know, it's very difficult. So there is some data gaps that need filling in order for us to be able to analyze what policies actually work. And then backing up to this idea of stewardship, we talk about stewardship in the making better policies. And it's a concept that New Zealand is particularly referred to in cabinet papers about the expectations on farmers by society when you produce, that you do so in accordance with the laws and within the environmental and boundaries. So yeah, this is an interesting example and ties into the multifunctionality aspects of agricultural production and the need for agriculture policymakers to be talking with health and ministries of social development about food policy, poverty, and of course, ministries for environment. So thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ellie, for this for these comments. We have now had a first round of comments and a first round of counter comments, so to say. In the meanwhile, I see that it is really high level what we are doing because nobody dares to ask questions through the chat. But I have kind of predicted this for myself. And I have some questions myself ready. And at the same time, I see that Peter Schmidt is in the room. And Peter Schmidt is president of the EEAC Council, the EU Council for Social and Economic, whatever. Sorry, I forgot, Peter. And he's president of the Agriculture, Rural Development and Environment section in that council. And the committee it is, of course. I knew I was wrong. And I have a general question to you, Peter Schmidt. Having heard all this, how do you think that policymakers should design policies that are coherent across different dimensions, such as the dimensions we have heard, food security, livelihoods, and environment? What do you think, Peter?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan. It's not only for you a problem, our committee's name, the European Economic and Social Committee. I had 5 years to learn it now because I'm a member of this committee. And as you know, we are composed on 3 groups and we are the House of Civil Society. And I come later on is how important it would be to integrate the civil society into this process. And I'm the current president of the NAT section, and I'm a German trade unionist. Perhaps it's necessary that you know that and realize it because I have some critical aspects.
You're not coming perfectly through, Peter, and now your micro was
perhaps it's due to my trade union nature. At first, thank you very much for this report. I think this is a very, very comprehensive report, and I share all the comments have been taken it before me. And I would like to remind some of you know that the ESC already, we have been the first European institution who called for a comprehensive food policy already 5 years ago. And all that what we have discussed and what we see in the report is already written in our opinions. It's not only one. We produced healthy diets, unfair trading practices, and so on and so on. So, and let me reflect a bit more critical than my colleagues did in this report. I share the analysis, but as Andre said, the conclusions and recommendations, I would say they must be much stronger. And when I heard Koen, when you have presented the report, I really miss the sense of urgency. You said it in the replies, so there is the urgency, but when we read it and when we hear the presentation, I miss really the push to say we have to change the system. Give you 2 examples. You talk about the efficiencies, and you say the efficiencies are good. I do not know whether this is as good as we see that in the report, because I could ask, Could that be that this efficiency has led to a loss of biodiversity, much more accelerated than before? The second critical point is the food price. So when the report says this has all led to lower food prices, and let me say that quite clear. I think this is one of the biggest problems within the food supply chain that we have. Food prices, they are too low, and we can't solve the social problems and the social. It's not on the food policy to solve the social problems and to make social policies. So that's why our recommendation is quite clear. So we say we have to integrate much more, and this we would be happy to elaborate this much more, to integrate much more the civil society into this process. We have a clear recommendation. We say we have to create food policy councils, and we see from Arno's example, we had already the chance years ago to discuss that in Barcelona with these recommendations. We need European food policy councils, national food policy councils, regional and local food policy councils, because these are instruments in order to break these silos, which I fully agree is necessary in order to come to policy. Secondly, I think we need ministers for food systems. As long as we have this, ministers for agriculture for this, so we need exactly a food systems approach in all the. I talk about the Europe in all the member states. So in order to do this, we have to address, and this is the third point in which I'm a bit skeptical, is the interest issue. So we all know the problems. They are all on the table. We all know that. But why we can't overcome? That's the question. For me, the reason is clear. It's because of interests. It's only because of interests. It's not because we do not find the right policy-making process. No, it's because of interests. And this lobby system, Koen, yes, we need lobby, absolutely. But also, this lobby system has led exactly to the situation where we are. And when we look at the food supply chain, Jan, I'm finishing now because I don't want to be that long. When we look at the full supply chain, we have an absolute unfair situation within the whole food supply chain. While we spend a lot of money for farmers, fair enough, the conditionalities are a problem, but fair enough to spend. At the same time, we have interests in the retail sector. They have a collective bargaining power in order to press farmers or processors. But we have also the big multinationals earning huge amount of money, which is not sustainable. So when we talk about the SDGs, what is sustainable? Come on, is it sustainable when companies earn 20%? 20%? Is it sustainable having 2%? So, and this I miss in the report. In order that you don't address this, you don't address exactly this problem, because this is one of the main issues why we are not able to change the system. So that's why our recommendations are clear. We need the food policy councils, and we need a structured involvement of the civil society. The ESC is ready to do that. We produced a lot of papers. We are also the house to invite all the stakeholders, and it would be fine. And we already proposed it to the commission. And one of the previous commissioners, he said, yes, let's do it.
Okay.
We wait.
Thank you, Peter. You forced us to look at the interests and especially at the balance of power between interests. This is the blind spot, as you say. I see questions coming in. First, and David Baldock, I noted that you have a question too, but first I have the questions that came in by chat. Sabine Dechka, if I pronounce well, has a question that has a bit of relation with what Peter said. The OECD talks about interests, but how to identify them? Koen mentioned in his presentation the identification of it as an important thing, and also the possible compensation of winners and losers as a main strategy. Will this suffice? Sabine, do you want to comment on this, or do I give the floor immediately to Koen?
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, because there's a second comment. I was too quick with sending the first one. What we're seeing in the Netherlands is that it's getting more and more problematic to identify the winners and losers, as Koen mentioned them in his presentation. And that has to do with farmers taking up other tasks in tourism, research, social areas, and other areas. And well, the main question is like, how can you acknowledge in policy development this diversification of tasks and interests in the end? We cannot identify a group of certain farmers that are losers or winners anymore.
Okay, thank you very much. Before giving Koen the floor, Hannah, I've seen your question mark as well, so you will be given the floor too. Koen, floor is yours.
Thank you for those comments. So let's see where to start. So Peter, you make some interesting points about involving civil society, and you reiterated that we should have put more of a sense of urgency in the report. So as I already mentioned, I think that's probably a fair point. So we didn't mean to undersell how big the challenges are. But there are a couple of specific points you mentioned that I'd like to respond to. So first, you ask whether efficiency is good. I would say absolutely yes. So that's really one point where I have fairly strong opinions about. Because the way that efficiency is defined is, people sometimes use the word productivity, but productivity has a bit of an ambiguous term. So for example, in a farm context, people sometimes say productivity while they mean yields, ton per hectare. But for an economist, that's not really efficiency, because it might just reflect that you're using more fertilizer, and it might mean that you're not taking into account water use, etc. So the proper way of thinking about efficiency is how much can you achieve in terms of valuable outputs, given how many inputs you've been using. And if you can do more, if you can have more efficiency, it means by definition having more output for the same amount of inputs, which means that all else equal, you're actually reducing the footprint on the environment. So that's true within a farm or at a certain level. It's less clear if you take it into a systems point of view, because you could have some kind of perverse effect where, like for example, the Jevons paradox, that cars might become more fuel efficient and therefore people drive more. But there is research that actually shows that for agriculture, for global agriculture, that efficiency has been land saving at the global level. Not necessarily at a local level, but at a global level it has been, because of how patterns of agriculture have shifted around. There's also a question of sufficiency versus necessity. So we're not saying that just efficiency gains are going to be sufficient the efficiency gains are sufficient for sustainability, but it's going to be very difficult to achieve any kind of sustainable growth without those efficiency gains. They're an important precondition for that.
Okay, cool. Short, because the questions are pouring in. Okay.
You made a point about unfair food supply chains. It's actually an area where we have done research. It's not in this report because we were doing it in parallel, and we published it in, I think, January or February, so that's available on the OECD website. I did a review myself of the literature on market power in agricultural supply chains. And actually the evidence is not as clear as you say, Peter. So if you look at the actual evidence, there's been plenty of academic work by competition authorities, work by observatories by the government, that concludes that in general, there's not that much evidence to say that other players have much stronger positions in the supply chain compared to farmers. Okay. And for example, you mentioned 20% profit margins for multinationals. That's only true for companies like Coca-Cola or Unilever who are producing branded goods. It's for sure not true for places like slaughterhouses, or retailers themselves, who often have the 2 to 3% margins you were talking about. This is also true for like the large commodity traders like Cargill and so on. They are usually in the 3 to 5% profit margin range. So I don't think that's correct. But farm interests are an important one. And if you think about sustainability, for example, you could say, if you think about a policy proposal like moving away from ruminant livestock towards plant-based diets, it's not the retailers who are worried about this, because they don't care whether it's plant-based milk or actual milk that they're selling. It is the farmers who have ruminant livestock who are very worried about that. So it's important when we're talking about interests that we don't fall into a simple vision of who are the bad guys and who are the good guys. Okay. There's different interests, and it's important to keep that in mind. So
I'll stop you. I'll start an analogy to food policy. I'll start to ration the time. Everybody gets 3 minutes. David, the floor is yours. 3 minutes.
Thanks a lot. I'll try to be quick on that. It's David Baldock from the Institute for European Environmental Policy. I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you. I haven't read the report. I agreed a lot with some of the comments that Marcus and others made about a way we capture normative issues is sometimes through embedded policy. And building on that, I think I felt you slightly underestimated the importance of climate change and particular policy response to climate change on mitigation. All the actors in the food chain are responding to this, and that this is a target-driven, time-limited process, and consumers are reacting perhaps in a more value-led way, but most of the players in the food chain are starting to set themselves targets. They're readjusting their strategies, and I can't help thinking this is a very important crystallizing force for actually unblocking some changes, not necessarily always the most helpful way, highlighting trade-offs and synergies. And in a way, it's an opportunity for a food community who's looking for sort of rational approach to reconciling some difficult issues to actually get on a train which is going to leave the station anyway, you know. So I just thought you slightly underestimated that. And one more specific point arising from that, I mean, we've made some of the progress around climate has been made through a compensatory logic, the just transition narrative. And I suspect we need that in the food system too. You know, it's not a pretty subject to pay people off if you look at it cynically. And of course, the OECD rightly, you know, deplores that. But actually, in my lifetime in ag policy, we have made progress through paying people off. We went to decoupling through compensatory measures and so forth. So I think to set that aside is you know, a little over optimistic and perhaps, you know, unhelpful even, you know, and we do need some kind of just transition and to then work out, well, what that means in the food system.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Good comments, interesting comments. I'll give the floor now to Hanna Janacek of the German Council for Sustainable Development. Hanna.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for the report. I think the framework is amazing. It resonated well with me, having done research on food systems for many years. But moving into a council that advises the German government from a multi-stakeholder perspective on implementing food systems, the reality check has been really harsh. And I couldn't subscribe more to everything Peter Schmidt said, to be honest. To start with the R&E Council, it's a council where I sit in a working group with the board members of multinationals, with the board members of environmental unions, with the board members of the Agriculture Society of Germany. And finding a common ground on food systems is really difficult. And here, like, interests and values is of critical importance to move ahead. I think the framework you shared is of really great value. And I think like the list of 5 points you gave, I think is something everybody should use. But even within a council that advises the German government, it's quite critical to come up with a strategy on food systems. And we've done this, we've developed a recommendation last year, and we did it because the State Secretaries Committee met last year on food systems, which we actually thought is great that they agreed to do this. But then if you look at the German Sustainable Development Strategy, you have indicators for all SDGs, but they are in the responsibility of all the ministries. And the trends, if you look only at the indicators that are relevant for the food systems, like the target image that you produce in your report as well, they are all negative or they are too slow to be achieved. So we are committed to the SDGs in Germany, but the trends are not showing the way. And if you look at the measures, they are also not aiming, they are not ambitious enough to achieve a coherent and sustainable food system. So we do have really a problem in implementation as well. Like, the responsibility of these issues is within different line ministries. And that's why I said I couldn't agree more to what Peter Schmidt said. Like, we need a Minister of Food Systems. We need a commitment to a food strategy. And I will be the first one joining your webinar on food systems in May. But there is so much to do to get this coherence in implementation, but also in advisory bodies, that we shouldn't underestimate the interest and values issue when it comes to food systems. And the same holds true, to be honest, for other critical issues like transition of energy systems. These are the controversial topics of our times, and we have these interests. And to move ahead with a system strategy, I think, it's quite critical that we really look also in the implementation. So yeah, I would like to thank you for the report. It resonated well here, and yeah, I will bring it back to our council and hope we can profit from it. Thank you.
Very positive feedback, Hannah. Thank you, and also for the arguments you gave. And exactly 3 minutes, by the way. So I now give the floor to Josephine Hintz, and then there are some other intervenants by the chat that, if chance be, that I give the floor as well. Josephine.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
So I work for EEAC Local Governments for Sustainability, a big organization really working with the local level, right? And I do want to flag a comment there, and I'm curious to hear your perspective on it. And we closely work with the One Planet Network and the Sustainable Procurement Program, actually, with the OECD as well as the FAO, and here specifically also towards the Food System Summit with cities kind of organizing food dialogues. And we are currently also starting work on mapping the power of procurement across the food value chain. So really mapping models and case studies, how can public authorities such as national governments, but also local governments or universities, hospitals really impact the food system at the different stages. And so I'd be really interested to hear from you how your report also links to procurement, perhaps, as a way to institutionalize the policies and operationalize the commitments to sustainable food systems, and also what your perspective is on kind of enabling the local level, of course. And I'm also very much interested, similar to what Hannah says, to follow your webinar series, and I'm very keen to dive into the report in the coming weeks. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much for this comment and these questions, Josephine. I propose that I, in the end, give the floor back to the OECD people to answer very shortly on everything they have heard. There are some remaining questions. One is from Jeanne Moore. She is suggesting to use data mining. I mean, supermarkets are already data mining, and those data could be used for the general good. Jeanne, do you want to comment? You're not there anymore, apparently. Then another comment. Yes.
No, good morning. Good
Yes.
morning. No, I'm finding it really interesting and stimulating discussion. It was just a small little thing in the chat.
Okay.
But no, really nice to hear Ireland being mentioned in relation to deliberative examples. But I think our biggest challenge is in food system transformation. So I'm listening and learning, but thank you, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Then Mark Harrison, you had a comment as well on procurement policies. They need to lead to the solutions. What research has been done to prove the use of public sector procurement to act as a catalyst? Mark, do you want to share some comments on this? No, you have to be faster in this world. Then Leda Reinhout, you had a long comment, I think, on animal well-being, animal health. Is this included in the research? Leda, do you want to say something?
Yes, thank you, Jan. Yes, it was just a question to Koen, but I already raised it to him, so he's going to answer me on that as well. But I think in general, I think when we talk about food systems, etc., I don't hear always something about, I mean, farmed animals, the animal health, which is related to public health. I mean, all these things that we are now experiencing in this COVID pandemic. So I was just curious on how the role of animals, I mean, farmed animals, is included in this whole discussion. Thank you so much.
Are there any other questions? Did I miss something? I see there's another long message that I can't synthesize now. André, you want to say something?
Yes, please. I wanted to, I forgot that, in fact, the protein debate and also I think the zoonosis debate, I think this will be on the table. And well, sure. Prominent WHO reports on that are going to have a tremendous impact in the post-pandemic phase. So I want to endorse this remark. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have exhausted all the questions. I now give the floor to Koen, Lian, or Ellie And don't be afraid, my final comment will be maximum a half minute. So you have still 7 or 8 minutes.
Thank you. Those are really, well, that's really a diverse set of questions. So all of them really challenging and thought-provoking. So let me try and cover as much as I can. So Sabine asked, how can you identify winners and losers, especially since farmers nowadays have more diverse farm incomes? It's a really good question. And actually, it's one of the strange things is that in general, despite the fact that agricultural policy often tries to raise farm incomes, we don't always have a lot of good information on what those farm incomes look like, especially the off-farm income, which is exactly what you mentioned. So fully agree. And it's kind of strange that that is not researched more in depth. So as we mentioned, we're going to be doing some work on data gaps. That might be one of those data gaps that comes up. So David Baldock, you mentioned the just transition, which indeed is something that people are discussing in other contexts, but there's also more and more talk about this in the case of food systems. So there is a project called the Just Rural Transition, which is working together with the Food and Land Use Coalition and so on. So they are actually thinking about questions like this. We're not by ourselves, we're not necessarily opposed to compensatory logic. It's just that a lot of the current farm policies are not really compensating farmers for a transition to something else. A lot of it is just business as usual that is being supported. So Hannah, you made some really good points about the critical importance of interests and values and the need for commitment. And this is completely consistent with the OECD view on sustainable development. So we have a group of people in our governance directorate who look specifically at policy coherence for sustainable development. And we've borrowed a lot of their insights for our work on policy coherence as well. That is what they say, actually. They say that if you want this policy coherence and you want to move forward on sustainable development, it has to have high level political commitment. And so they actually suggest having an office directly under the Prime Minister, so as part of the Cabinet Office, to make sure it has the necessary political profile. That being said, raising it to that level is not necessarily the solution for everything. It could help. It doesn't necessarily help. There's also a cost to having that kind of policy integration because it does raise the bureaucratic costs of coordinating, and it might also weaken the focus on some other aspects. So there are some costs and benefits as well. Josephine, great point on procurement. And so I imagine you've been in touch with our colleagues from the governance directorate who work on procurement. So that's Erika Beauvais and her colleagues. Procurement is definitely a really powerful lever, especially because it's really large. On the other hand, so I think it has large potential. On the other hand, it is important that is fact-based. And so some of the points we made on policy coherence about the need to dig deeper and not just accept claims about synergies and trade-offs at face value, but rigorously evaluate them, I think are especially true for procurement, especially at local levels. There's often a presumption that local products are more sustainable, whereas we know that actually transport costs are a minor part of the environmental damage. Most of that has to do with more with where stuff is produced and how it is produced and what exactly is produced. So that would be one point I would mention there. So yeah, interesting point on data mining, and indeed it is true that the private sector has a lot of information on food composition and on diets, etc., etc. And so there's interesting questions there about are there ways that governments can work with the private sector or can design some kind of mechanisms so that the private sector has an incentive to volunteer that data. So that will probably also, we already have some work on that in the context of healthier food policies and healthier diets, and we'll probably continue along those lines and trying to think about those kinds of mechanisms in our work on data and evidence gaps. And then finally, so Leida, you mentioned animal health. André, you mentioned the protein debate and the zoonosis debate. So in general, we focus on the triple challenge. We don't need to say that those are the only 3 objectives of food systems. In reality, we all know that what we're expecting from food systems is enormous. The list is very long. It includes cultural dimensions as well. It includes animal well-being. It includes many other aspects. So we didn't mean to say that those were the only things that matter. It's again, this thing I mentioned earlier, that if you try to draw the full picture of the food system, you will never finish. So we need to have more of a way of looking rather than a map of the landscape. So part of that way of looking is this kind of realization that there might be unexpected spillovers on other areas that we care about. So I think we don't really cover animal well-being. I think we mentioned it in passing once or twice maybe, but it's not really something we cover very thoroughly. But that doesn't mean that it's unimportant, definitely not. So I still have a minute and a half left, I think.
Very well
Maybe
done,
I can make a 20 second comment, which loops back to the first remarks we heard, I think, from Marcus, who mentioned the importance of thinking about pathways and scenarios. And I think this also links to the issue of transitions, right? Because you have the big normative picture, but you need, I think, if you're going to bring people, all the stakeholders along towards that change, you have to have a vision of how long that is going to take, what happens along the way. And it's not like it's going to be something that happens instantaneously. Mm-hmm. So I just thought that especially these conversations about transitions also need to recognize the time component. And those conversations are important in terms of making sure stakeholders are brought into the debate in a constructive way.
Thank you very much, Leanne. Time is indeed a very essential component in systems theory. I want to close this meeting. I want to thank you all, especially our colleagues from the OECD and also from the EEAC for organizing and co-organizing this event. I thank the speakers for their presentations and/or for their reflections. I thank you all for participating actively or at least attentively. We have learned a lot. We have learned that there is no silver bullet, but we have talked a lot about different types of bullets and about better aiming them. And I think this was very important and is very important for the future. Please note that there will be a questionnaire by the OECD. I don't know technically how it will be spread, but for evaluation of this meeting. And I think this exchange of thoughts seduces us all to read the report thoroughly. And I hope our lecture bears fruit and helps us all to contribute to the formation of a better policies for agriculture, food, and environment. Thank you very much all and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Jan, just before everybody leaves, if they could please fill out the poll, which we've just fired up now.
Yes. Yeah, we see it now. Okay, that was a technical thing I didn't know. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So all fill in the poll before leaving. You heard?
I forgot about launching the poll. I was so enjoying the session. So that was an epic fail there. I have to skip off now to meet with the JIZ guys. So that was awesome. Really enjoyed it. I'll see you later.
Great. Bye-bye, Ali.
Really great.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
This is great.
Bye.